The rain drummed steadily on the roof of Jake's tiny apartment as he sorted through past-due bills spread across his kitchen table. Another rejection email glowed on his phone screen. The 5th this month. At 35, life wasn't supposed to look like this. Newly divorced, struggling to make rent, and eating ramen noodles more often than he cared to admit. When his phone rang, Jake almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers usually meant debt collectors these days. Something made him pick up anyway. Hello? Is this Jake Mitchell? The voice belonged to an older man with a slight country accent. Speaking, Jake replied, bracing himself for bad news. This is Howard Daniels, attorney from Pine Creek. I'm handling your great-uncle Ed's estate. I've been trying to reach you for several weeks. Jake blinked in confusion. Great-uncle Ed? He vaguely remembered a quiet old man who sent birthday cards with $5 bills when he was little. I didn't know he passed away. We lost touch years ago, Jake admitted, feeling a twinge of guilt. Well, son, he left you something. His cabin, on Silver Lake and all the land that goes with it. Everything's paid off, no mortgage, no liens, it's yours free and clear. Jake nearly dropped the phone. There must be some mistake, why would he leave it to me? The lawyer chuckled. Your name is right there in the will. Said you were the only one in the family who ever wrote him back. 3 days later, Jake's beat-up Honda rolled down a gravel road lined with towering pine trees. The directions had taken him deep into the countryside, far from city noise and crowds. As he rounded the final bend, Silver Lake appeared before him, its surface shimmering in the afternoon sun. And there sat the cabin. Nothing fancy, just weathered logs and a stone chimney. The porch sagged slightly and shutters hung crooked on windows that needed washing. But something about it felt right, like it was waiting for him. Home sweet home, I guess, Jake muttered, grabbing his duffel bag from the back seat. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Dust particles danced in sunbeams streaming through the windows. Everything inside was simple but solid. Handmade furniture, shelves lined with old books, a cast-iron stove in the corner. The place smelled of pine and memories. Jake spent that first day exploring. He found fishing gear in the shed out back and a canoe turned upside down under a tarp. In the kitchen cabinet, canned goods with labels faded but still readable. Uncle Ed had lived simply but comfortably. That night, as Jake sat on the porch, watching stars appear over the lake, a feeling of peace washed over him for the first time in months. Maybe this unexpected turn was exactly what he needed. The next morning, he started cleaning. The place needed work, lots of it, but Jake had nothing but time. He swept away cobwebs, scrubbed windows, and fixed the leaky kitchen faucet. When he pulled up a curled corner of carpet in the main room, he noticed something odd. One floorboard looked different from the others. Curious, Jake pried it up with a screwdriver. Beneath it lay a metal box about the size of a thick novel. The lock was old but gave way easily when he worked at it. Inside, wrapped carefully in oilcloth, he found bundles of papers yellow with age. Some were letters. Others were legal documents, with official stamps and signatures. As Jake spread them across the floor, his heart beat faster. These weren't just random papers. They were property deeds, survey maps, land records, all dated 1947. According to these documents, Uncle Ed hadn't just owned this small cabin and its yard. He'd owned acres of lakefront property, including what looked like the entire cove on the north side of the lake. What in the world? Jake whispered, looking out the window toward where fancy houses now dotted the shoreline. This can't be right. Little did he know. Those papers were about to change everything. 2 weeks flew by as Jake threw himself into fixing up the cabin. Each day brought small victories: a repaired step, a freshly painted wall, a garden bed cleared of weeds. For the first time in months, he slept deeply at night, exhausted in the best way possible. On a sunny Tuesday morning, Jake was on his hands and knees, replacing rotted boards on the dock, when the crunch of tires on gravel announced visitors. He stood up, wiping sweat from his forehead, curious who might be dropping by. Uncle Ed's lawyer had mentioned the nearest neighbor was half a mile away. A shiny black SUV with tinted windows had pulled up beside his Honda. The contrast between the vehicles couldn't have been more obvious. His dusty, dented car next to their gleaming luxury ride. 3 people stepped out, dressed like they were headed to a business meeting rather than a lakeside visit. Their leader was a tall woman with silver hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face into a permanent look of disapproval. Behind her stood a balding man in an expensive golf shirt and a younger woman clutching a tablet. "Can I help you folks?" Jake called out, trying to sound friendly despite the way they were frowning at his cabin. The silver-haired woman marched toward him. "I'm Patricia Reynolds, president of the Silver Lake Homeowners Association. This is our treasurer, Tom Wilson, and our secretary, Diane. Are you the current occupant of this structure?" The way she said structure made it sound like she was referring to a pile of garbage. "I'm Jake Mitchell. I inherited this cabin from my great-uncle Ed." He extended his hand, but Patricia ignored it. "Well, Mr. Mitchell, I'm afraid we have some unfortunate news. This property is in violation of at least 23 HOA regulations. The exterior is unacceptable, that boat shed is not to code, and those trees need to be properly trimmed." Her voice was as cold as lake water in February. Jake blinked in confusion. "HOA? I don't understand. My uncle owned this place outright for decades." Patricia's thin lips formed something between a smile and a sneer. "Your uncle was a stubborn man who refused to acknowledge the changes around him. Silver Lake Estates was developed 15 years ago. Every property owner must comply with our standards." "But I never signed anything," Jake protested. "How can rules apply to me if I never agreed to them?" The man named Tom stepped forward. "Your uncle was given numerous opportunities to comply. We have all the paperwork right here." He nodded to Diane, who tapped on her tablet and turned it toward Jake. "We've finally secured legal permission to address the situation permanently." Jake squinted at the screen. "What does that mean exactly?" Patricia straightened her already perfect posture. "It means, Mr. Mitchell, that this eyesore is scheduled for demolition. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. "Demolition? You can't be serious." "I assure you, we're quite serious." Patricia nodded to Diane, who pulled a thick envelope from her bag and thrust it at Jake. "Here are copies of all violation notices, the court order, and the demolition schedule. I suggest you start packing." Jake's hands shook as he took the envelope. "This is my home. You can't just bulldoze it. It's an eyesore bringing down property, values for everyone else," Tom said, gesturing toward the gleaming mansions barely visible through the trees across the lake. "The community has standards." "But," Jake started to argue. Patricia cut him off. 30 days, Mr. Mitchell. After that, we'll handle it our way." They turned in unison and walked back to their SUV. As they pulled away, Jake stood frozen, the envelope clutched in his hands, watching dust settle on the road. The peaceful feeling he'd found was shattered. His fresh start was about to be bulldozed. Literally, unless he could find a way to stop them. Jake couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he imagined bulldozers crushing the cabin while Patricia Reynolds watched with that cold smile. By morning, his shock had turned to anger. This place was all he had left. "I'm not giving up without a fight," he told a curious blue jay watching from the windowsill. First stop, the county courthouse. The clerk at the records office, a friendly older woman named Betty with reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain, listened sympathetically to his story. "Those Silver Lake folks think they own everything," she said, shaking her head. "Let's see what we can find about your uncle's property." 2 hours later, Jake left with copies of the original deed, but not much clarity. The legal language confused him, and the boundaries described used landmarks that probably didn't exist anymore. "You need Liz Santos," Betty had advised him. "Best property attorney in the county. Office is above the hardware store on Main Street." Liz turned out to be a straight-talking woman in her 40s with no-nonsense glasses and a habit of getting right to the point. "So the HOA wants to bulldoze your cabin?" she asked, after Jake explained his situation. "Did you bring the papers they gave you?" Jake handed over the envelope. Liz flipped through it with practiced efficiency, occasionally making notes. Her frown deepened with each page. "This is interesting," she said finally. They've built quite a case, but something doesn't add up. These court orders reference property lines that don't match your deed. She looked up. Did your uncle leave? Anything else? Any surveys, maps, correspondence about the property? Jake's mind flashed to the metal box. Actually, yes, I found some old papers hidden under the floorboards. Hidden papers? Liz raised an eyebrow. That's usually either nothing or something big. Bring everything tomorrow morning. Back at the cabin, Jake carefully spread all the documents from the metal box across the kitchen table. Most were yellowed with age. Some had official-looking stamps and seals. He noticed his uncle had organized everything meticulously, with handwritten notes in the margins. The next day, Liz cleared her schedule. As they went through the documents together, her excitement grew visibly. Jake, do you understand what you have here? She asked, pointing to a survey map from 1947. According to this, your uncle's property extends much farther than just the cabin lot. His land includes nearly half a mile of lakefront. Jake leaned closer. But there are houses all along that stretch now? Exactly. Liz pulled out another document. And according to this deed, your uncle legally purchased the entire North Cove area. Do you know what's there now? Jake thought about what he'd seen driving around the lake. Some fancy houses. And I think their community center or something. Big building with a dock and tennis courts. The Silver Lake Estates Clubhouse. Liz's eyes sparkled. Their crown jewel, $3 million of luxury lakefront amenities. But how could they build on my uncle's land? My guess? When developers came in the 1980s, they assumed the property lines were different. Look at these letters. Liz pointed to a folder of correspondence. Your uncle wrote to them pointing out their mistake, but they ignored him. Jake stared at the papers in disbelief. Are you saying? I'm saying, Liz replied, tapping the survey map, that according to these documents, you own the land under their precious clubhouse. They've been trespassing for 15 years. Jake sat back, stunned. So they can't demolish my cabin? Oh, it's much bigger than that. Liz gathered the papers into a neat pile. They've been bullying your uncle for years, and now they're trying to bully you. I think it's time they learned a lesson about property rights. For the first time since the HOA's visit, Jake smiled. What's our next move? We get these documents officially verified, file the proper paperwork, and then, Liz grinned. We request a meeting with the HOA board, at their clubhouse, of course. The next 2 weeks were a blur of paperwork, phone calls, and meetings. Liz worked like a tornado, getting the old documents officially verified by experts, and filing the proper legal notices. Jake spent his time fixing up the cabin, partly out of spite, but mostly because it felt more like home with each passing day. Are you ready for this? Liz asked as they stood in the parking lot of the Silver Lake Estates Clubhouse. The building was impressive, all stone and glass with a massive deck overlooking the water. Jake straightened his tie. He'd bought a new shirt for the occasion, his first purchase that wasn't ramen noodles or building supplies in months. Ready as I'll ever be, he replied, trying to ignore the butterflies in his stomach. According to the sign out front, the HOA was holding their annual summer gala this evening. Perfect timing. Liz had insisted they deliver the news in front of everyone, not just the board. Remember, she said, patting the folder tucked under her arm, let me do the legal talking. You just be yourself. The scruffy cabin guy who owns their clubhouse, Jake said with a nervous laugh. Inside, the clubhouse buzzed with activity. Well-dressed people sipped champagne while a string quartet played in the corner. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the sunset over the lake. Jake couldn't help noticing that even the bathrooms probably cost more than his entire cabin. Heads turned as they entered. Jake caught snippets of whispered conversations. Who invited them? Isn't that the man from that eyesore cabin? What is Patricia going to say? As if summoned by her name, Patricia Reynolds appeared in front of them, wearing an elegant blue dress that probably cost more than Jake's car. Mr. Mitchell, she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. This is a private event for homeowners association members only. I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to leave. Liz stepped forward. Actually, Mrs. Reynolds, we're here on official business. We've requested a meeting with the board several times this week, but you've ignored us. Since everyone is here, this seems like the perfect opportunity." Patricia's smile tightened. "This is hardly the appropriate time or place." "I think it's exactly the right time and place," Jake said, finding his courage, "since it concerns this clubhouse and everyone who uses it." By now, a small crowd had gathered around them. Jake recognized Tom and Diane from their visit to his cabin. A balding man with an expensive watch stepped forward. "I'm Richard Taylor, vice president of the board. What's this about?" Liz smiled. "Perhaps we could address everyone at once." "It concerns the entire association." Patricia looked like she wanted to object, but Richard nodded. "Of course, we were about to make announcements anyway." Minutes later, Jake found himself standing next to Liz at the front of the room. The music had stopped. All eyes were on them. Patricia and the other board members stood to one side, watching with suspicious expressions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Liz began, her confident voice carrying across the room. "My name is Elizabeth Santos, attorney at law. I represent Mr. Jake Mitchell, who recently inherited property on Silver Lake from his great-uncle, Edward Mitchell." She paused, letting that sink in. "Some of you may know that the HOA has been threatening to demolish Mr. Mitchell's cabin. What you may not know is that we've discovered something quite interesting about the property lines in this community." Liz opened her folder and held up a large survey map. "According to official records verified by the county surveyor just yesterday, Edward Mitchell purchased a significant portion of lakefront property in 1947. This property includes," she paused, "for effect, the exact land where this clubhouse now stands." The room erupted. Some people gasped. Others started shouting questions. Patricia's face went from pale to bright red in seconds. "This is absurd," she sputtered. "That's impossible." Liz calmly laid out document after document on a nearby table. The property deeds, the original surveys, tax records showing Mr. Edward Mitchell paid taxes on this land for decades, and letters he sent to developers pointing out their error, all legally verified. A gray-haired man pushed forward. "Are you saying this young man owns our clubhouse?" Jake stepped up beside Liz. "I'm saying the land under this building belongs to me, and unlike some people, I don't believe in bulldozing other people's property without talking first." Chaos erupted in the clubhouse. People crowded around the table where Liz had laid out the documents, pointing and arguing. Some residents shouted that it had to be a scam, while others demanded to know how the board could have let this happen. Patricia's voice cut through the noise. "This is ridiculous. We've been using this land for 15 years. It belongs to the association now, regardless of some ancient paperwork." Liz shook her head. "That's not how property law works, Mrs. Reynolds. You're thinking of adverse possession, which doesn't apply here for several reasons." "What reasons?" someone called out. "For starters," Liz explained, "Edward Mitchell never abandoned his claim to the property. He paid taxes on it every year until his death. He sent registered letters to the developers and later to the HOA, pointing out their error. I have copies right here." She tapped a folder. "The HOA board received these letters and chose to ignore them." All eyes turned to Patricia. Her usual confidence wavered. That's not true," she stammered. "I never saw any letters." An older man stepped forward. "Actually, Patricia, that's not entirely accurate." He turned to the crowd. "I'm Harold Green. I served on the original board when the clubhouse was built. There were indeed questions about the property line, but the developer assured us everything was fine." The room fell silent. "You knew?" Richard asked, his face reddening. "The board knew there might be a problem with the land?" Harold nodded slowly. "The developer said the old man was confused, that his property ended at the road. We wanted the clubhouse in this location because of the view, so..." He shrugged helplessly. A woman in the back shouted, "So you built a $3 million clubhouse on land you knew might not be ours?" More angry voices joined in. Jake watched as years of resentment bubbled to the surface. Apparently, the board had made many unpopular decisions over the years. We pay thousands in HOA fees. They rejected my fence request 3 times. They fined the Johnsons when their child was sick and couldn't mow. Patricia tried to regain control. "Everyone, please, this changes nothing. We'll fight this in court. Mr. Mitchell has no right to come in here and threaten our community." "I'm not threatening anyone," Jake said, speaking up for the first time in several minutes. "I just don't want my home demolished." A middle-aged woman with kind eyes stepped forward. "I'm Ann Cooper. I've lived here for 10 years. She looked around at her neighbors. "Are we really the kind of community that bulldozes a man's home? That ignores property rights when they're inconvenient? That's not why I moved here." Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. Richard turned to Patricia. "How long have you known about this potential issue?" Patricia's mask of confidence cracked completely. "It doesn't matter. We can't let some cabin dweller dictate terms to us. Our property values won't matter if we're sued for building on someone else's land." Richard interrupted. "The association could be liable for millions." Jake watched as the room divided before his eyes. Patricia and a few loyal supporters huddled together, whispering frantically. Most residents, however, seemed genuinely concerned about doing the right thing. "What exactly do you want, Mr. Mitchell?" Ann asked. "Are you going to make us tear down the clubhouse?" All eyes turned to Jake. He looked around at the worried faces, thinking about how his uncle had lived all those years, knowing but never acting on this information. "No," Jake said finally. "I don't want to destroy anything. I just want what's fair." Richard stepped forward. "Perhaps we could discuss some sort of arrangement. A lease agreement, perhaps." Patricia gasped. "You can't be serious." "I'm completely serious," Richard replied. "The board has apparently been hiding this information for years. It's time we dealt with it properly." As Patricia stormed out, followed by her small group of supporters, Jake realized the balance of power had shifted. For the first time since receiving that demolition notice, he felt like he might actually win this fight. "I'm open to discussion," Jake said. "But first, the demolition order against my cabin needs to be withdrawn immediately." Richard nodded. "Consider it done." The next morning, Jake sat at his kitchen table staring at his ringing phone. The screen showed Richard Taylor, HOA. After 3 rings, he answered. "Hello, Mr. Taylor. Please call me Richard. I was hoping we could meet today to discuss our situation. Would noon work for you?" Jake looked around his cabin. The morning. Sun streamed through windows he'd cleaned himself. Birds chirped outside. This little place had become precious to him in ways he couldn't have imagined a month ago. "Sure, but not at the clubhouse," Jake replied. "How about here at the cabin? Might give you a different perspective." There was a pause. "That's actually a good idea. We'll see you at noon." By 11:30, Jake had swept the porch, made a pot of coffee, and set out the simple wooden chairs his uncle had carved years ago. Liz arrived first, her car kicking up dust on the gravel road. "You ready for this?" she asked, climbing the porch steps. Jake nodded. "I've been thinking about what I want, and what Uncle Ed might have wanted." At precisely noon, 3 cars pulled up. Richard stepped out of the first one, followed by Ann Cooper and Harold Green from last night's meeting. Jake noticed Patricia was not among them. "Welcome to my home," Jake said, gesturing to the chairs. "Coffee's hot if anyone wants some." Richard looked around, taking in the cabin and the peaceful lakefront. "You've done a lot of work here in just a few weeks." "It needed some love, that's all," Jake replied. Once everyone was settled with steaming mugs, Richard cleared his throat. "First, I want to apologize for how you've been treated. The board had an emergency meeting this morning. Patricia has been asked to step down as president." Jake raised his eyebrows but said nothing. "Second," Richard continued, "we've formally withdrawn the demolition order against your cabin. That should never have happened." "Thank you," Jake said simply. "Now, about the clubhouse situation." Richard leaned forward. "We've consulted with our attorney. Your claim appears to be legally sound. The question is, where do we go from here?" Liz nodded at Jake. They'd discussed this already. "I've thought a lot about this," Jake began. "I could demand you tear down the clubhouse. I could sell the land to developers. I could charge you millions in back rent." He paused. "But none of that feels right." Relief flashed across their faces. Instead, I'm proposing a compromise. I'll grant the association a long-term lease for the clubhouse property at a fair rate, much less than market value. In return, I want 3 things. Richard nodded cautiously. Go on. First, my cabin stays as is. No more complaints about property values or community standards. That's reasonable, Anne said. What else? Second, the HOA needs to change how it operates. More democratic decision-making. Less focus on perfect lawns and more on being actual neighbors. Harold frowned. What exactly does that mean? It means, Jake explained, that people shouldn't live in fear of getting fined because their fence is the wrong shade of brown or their child's bike was left out overnight. This should be a community, not a prison with nice views. Anne nodded enthusiastically. I've been saying this for years. And third, Richard asked, I want a portion of my lease payments to go into a community fund to help residents who might be struggling with home repairs or medical bills. My uncle lived here for decades watching this place become more and more exclusive. I think he'd like to see it become more inclusive. Silence fell as the HOA representatives exchanged glances. These are unusual requests, Richard said finally. This is an unusual situation, Liz pointed out. Anne smiled. I think they're wonderful ideas, exactly what this community needs. Harold scratched his chin. Patricia and her friends won't like it. Then they can sell their houses and move, Richard said with surprising firmness. This dispute has exposed some ugly truths about how we've been operating. Maybe it's time for a change. He extended his hand to Jake. We'll need to work out the details, but speaking for the new board leadership, I think we have the foundation of an agreement. As they shook hands, Jake glanced at the old photograph of Uncle Ed on the wall. The old man seemed to be smiling, a little wider than before. One more thing, Jake said. I'd like to host a neighborhood barbecue here next weekend. Get to know my neighbors properly. Anne laughed. A cabin warming party? Count me in. 1 year later, Jake stood on his dock watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and pink. So much had changed since that first day when he'd arrived with nothing but a duffel bag and dashed hopes. The cabin still looked like a cabin. He'd refused to turn it into some fancy lake house. But the improvements were obvious. The roof no longer leaked. The porch no longer sagged. Solar panels glinted on the south-facing slope, a modern touch that somehow fit the rustic setting. Jake had planted a vegetable garden where his uncle's had once been, and wildflowers bloomed along the winding path to the water. The sound of laughter drifted across the lake. At the clubhouse, families were gathering for the community's monthly potluck dinner. Kids raced around on the lawn while parents chatted and set up tables. These gatherings had become a regular thing. Not fancy galas where people showed off their wealth, but simple get-togethers where neighbors actually got to know each other. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from Anne. Don't forget to bring your famous cornbread. Everyone's asking for it. He smiled. Who would have thought he'd become known for his cornbread? Or that he'd have actual friends in what had once been such a hostile place? The lease agreement had been finalized 6 months ago. The HOA paid a fair rate for the clubhouse land, with 30% going into the Community Assistance Fund. Already the fund had helped the Wilsons fix their roof after a storm, and paid for a stair lift for old Mr. Peterson, who couldn't manage the steps to his lakeside home anymore. As for Patricia and her small group of supporters, they'd eventually sold their homes and moved to an even more exclusive community across the county. Good riddance, as Anne had put it. Jake grabbed his cornbread from the oven and headed out the door. As he walked the path around the lake toward the clubhouse, he nodded to neighbors working in their yards. People waved and called out greetings. This still surprised him sometimes, being treated like he belonged. At the clubhouse entrance, a new sign read, Silver Lake Community Center, a small but significant change from the former Silver Lake Estates exclusive clubhouse. Below it hung a smaller plaque that made Jake pause every time he saw it. The Edmund Mitchell Memorial Deck, it read, in honor of a man who knew that true wealth isn't found in what you own, but in what you share. The deck had been Richard's idea. Your uncle could have made our lives miserable any time during those years, he'd explained, but he chose peace instead. That's worth remembering. Jake spotted Liz at a table near the water, deep in conversation with Harold about some town council matter. She'd recently been elected to represent the Lake District, running on a platform of responsible development and community inclusion. "Jake!" Anne called, rushing over to take the cornbread. "Just in time, everyone's starving." As he mingled with his neighbors, Jake found himself next to Richard, who was watching children play a game of tag on the lawn. "You know," Richard said, thoughtfully, "when you first showed up with those property documents, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to our community." Jake laughed. "And now?" "Now I think it was the best thing. We needed that wake-up call." Richard gestured around at the diverse group of people chatting and eating together. "This is what a real community looks like." Later that evening, as fireflies began to appear over the water, Jake slipped away from the gathering. He walked back to his cabin in the soft summer darkness, guided by the moon's reflection on the lake. On his porch, he sat in one of his uncle's hand-carved chairs and looked out at the peaceful water. In the distance, lights from the clubhouse reflected on the surface, and the sound of music and laughter carried across the lake. "We did all right, Uncle Ed," Jake whispered to the night air. "We did all right." In his pocket, he fingered the folded letter he'd found months ago, hidden in the back of his uncle's old photo album. It was addressed to whoever comes after me and contained just one sentence. "Remember that a home isn't just a building or a piece of land. It's the heart you put into it and the hands you open to others." Jake had finally understood what his uncle had known all along.